So we will go from that and we will continue our football preview as we talk about the EBC teams that we cover. Let's start with Salem, as we just had one of their own, Carson Rhodes, on. Why don't we just segue right into Salem football and talk a little bit about what the Quakers are going to look like come 2021?
Yeah, the Quakers were 5-6 last year, 3-3. They were ranked 5th in the EBC. Looking at the offense, they were an offense that averaged over 26 points per game. They're returning a bunch of their starters from last year. Out of the guys that they lost, Jax Booth on wide receiver was one of the big ones. But, I mean, guys that they're returning, Blaze X-Line is a wide receiver. Jackson Johnson, too, quarterback for them, as well as Caleb Stockman on O-line and Carson Stockman on O-line. So they have a couple of really solid guys on O-line, both the Stockmans, and then you got Johnson at QB, and X-line's a really good wide receiver as well. I think Johnson, after setting a record, passing record on passing yards for Salem last year, I think he's ready to take that next step of improvement, and that was as a sophomore quarterback. So another one of those quarterbacks going in to his junior year who already had a dynamic sophomore year where he broke a school record. And, I mean, looking to have a better year, too, and he has that guy to throw to an X-line. He has a good offensive line in front of him. I think this Salem offense is ready to take that next step. I mean, 26 points per game last season. I expect them to be in the realm of the 30s this year, honestly.
How about that? You step on the field as a sophomore, you're already breaking school records. Like, geez, man, slow down a little bit. You pace yourself.
Yeah, they're looking to definitely be competitive too. Right around the middle of the pack last year, 5-6 is how they finished. They definitely want to be better last year, be in the winning record, and I think they definitely have a chance to do so. And I mean, you have a guy that might pass for 3,000 yards in Johnson. It's going to be definitely interesting.
And despite that, despite those passing numbers, they're still watching them. They're a pretty methodical offense. Not a lot of huge plays that were 30+ yards. They like to kind of dink and dunk and really drive down the field, even with the passing game. So, 26 a game for that style, really a high number for a team that is so methodical down the field like Salem was last year.
Yeah, and Jackson Johnson's also the type of guy that can run and break out of the pocket, and he can fight for those extra yards. And part of that speed is why he's so effective, too, as a defensive back. And then there you go him and pair him with the senior X-line, too. It's him and X-line on offense as quarterback and wide receiver. It's going to be him and X-line on defense as well, as they're going to be a pair of defensive backs, I think. They're going to be dynamic for Salem as well.
X-Factor, X-line, these headlines. I'm getting ready. For the headlines.
I think the dynamic of both of them, as well as on the other defense, I mean, Salem has a lot of defensive backs this year that I think are going to be fun to watch, as well as Dylan Monroy, as well as Ross Davidson. Their defensive back core is going to be solid, and I think that secondary is going to be huge for Salem and trying to limit the pass game, because there's a few teams in that EBC conference that can pass the ball pretty well, and you want to be able to contain them. So Salem having a very good secondary is going to be huge going forward.
Great segue again, Ty, to just dive deeper into the defense and talk about their personnel, what they have coming back, and what Salem's defense might look like in this season.
They also have a couple of guys, too, on the defensive line, and Damon Wolf and Josiah Haas, that I think are going to be huge, both seniors that are going to be on D-line, and they're going to be huge for stopping the runs up front. So you have a really good defensive line, and you have a bunch of guys in the secondary that are going to be huge. They might even run 5 defensive backs at one time in some sets, too. I wouldn't be surprised. But Corey Risen is going to be really your guy on the linebacker core. He's a real senior, and I think he's going to be the true leader of the linebackers, and you might exceed some of those linebackers, improve their game just because Corey's on the team and in charge really of the linebacking core as the lone senior that I could really point out to. That's going to be the linebacker, but he's going to be huge too in stopping those runs.
Yeah, and Salem's defense going to come up against some really high-powered offenses this year. Going to have to be bringing their A game every week, and I think they're up for it with all their returning.
I think so too. And I mean, you got 2 guys that are coming into their junior year for defensive back. Ross Davidson's coming into his sophomore year. He had a pretty good year last year too as a defensive back. Dylan Monroy is going to be very good, I think, this year. Jackson Johnson, depending on how much he plays, because he'll be quarterback as well, he'll be good too. But this was a Salem team that did allow less than 30 points per. It was around 29, I believe. But this was a team that I think can take that next level and stop offenses a lot more now that these defensive backs, these are real skilled positions, defensive back, and you got to be real smart in reading the offense and everything. And I think a lot of these defensive backs that have these extra years, your Dylan Munroys and your X lines now that are going to be seniors, and your Haas too on defensive line, but Ross Davidson too, that freshman going into a sophomore year defensive back. I think that extra year of experience is going to help them too, and I think that secondary is going to be vastly improved.
And their secondary will definitely be locked down. I think the biggest question mark for Salem is what are they going to have up front, because they're going to face a lot of teams that like to run the ball too. So I think it's going to be up to the line and the linebackers to kind of fortify that secondary so teams don't just say, well, you're really good at guarding the pass, so we're just going to run the ball and make you stop that and not even have to worry about your DBs.
Yeah, and I mean, really, when you're returning to an X line is going to be huge on that Salem offense, and I think that's what's going to help them on offense so much, because X line led, I think, all of EBC in every receiving category last year, and that's in receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns. I think getting that back at receiver, as well as Jackson Johnson, who I'm pretty sure led almost every category in passing category. I think passing touchdowns for sure. And I think passing yards as well as I think yards per carry too. So out of it, you have a guy at quarterback that's welling and
sophomore season too. I mean,
yeah. Sophomore season, he had the highest, I think, I'm pretty sure, most passing yards, most passing touchdowns, and most yards per carry in the EBC. And you have him paired with X line, who's a dynamic wide receiver, who's going to be good also on defense. But that Salem offense, I think, is going to be very fun to watch this year, and they're going to take that next step and to make that improvement.
I think Johnson can just break his own records.
He very well might too. And I mean, you're talking in a COVID year, this young man threw 2,800 yards, over 2,800 yards. This is very realistic that he's passing over 3,000 yards this season. And I mean, a guy that threw 30 touchdowns last year, it's very realistic that he can do the same thing in a 10-game regular season. A 3,000 30 touchdown guy, or 3,000 passing yards and 30 touchdown quarterback. I'll take that any day of the week if I'm Salem. It's just, can you build that defense to make the stops? Because I think they have the offensive weapons in place now.
And they're obviously Division 4, which is stacked locally in the playoff scene. You talk about Ursuline, who is the preseason #1. You talk about Poland, who got to Ursuline in the regional semifinals last year. You talk about, West Branch is in Division 4 too. So Salem's going to have a tough go. If they're lucky enough to make the playoffs, they got to make sure they're prepared. Talk about their schedule and what things they are doing in this 10-game slate to prepare themselves for what should be a very tough playoff run if they're lucky enough to get there.
They open it up August 19th at Crestview, and then they go August 27th home versus Beaver Local, September 3rd at East Liverpool, and that completes their mini tour of the Buckeye 8. They do 2 teams there, as well as face Crestview. And then they go Firestone home September 10th, at Alliance September 17th, home versus Minerva September 24th, at Marlington October 1st, at Carrollton October 8th, home versus Canton South October 15th. And why don't we just wait until we talk about West Branch, and then we'll talk about that game together, October 23rd, home versus West Branch, because that's just how special that game is between those two teams.
Unlike a lot of rivalries that we've talked about so far on our football previews, this one to close the season out. And because they're the two teams that we are lucky enough to represent of the EBC, and I think these are the two most prominent teams because they have such a huge rivalry in that EBC. So we're so lucky that we get to cover them, and what better way to close it out than with the rivalry of the EBC? Yeah, I mean, the rivalry games to close out the season, kind of a tradition in college football, and now obviously we get to see at least one on week 10 in high school realm. It's great to see rivals close out the season. So
before we talk about that game, though,
besides that game, I'm looking forward to one opening the season on a Thursday against Crestview. Going to be big. Both teams looking forward to very successful seasons, coming off of pretty good years last year, and that might be a shootout with both those offenses as athletic as they are.
I really like Salem's out-of-conference schedule. All YSN schools, by the way, but it's at Crestview.
Oh, yeah, and they get an extra non-conference schedule game because they're playing Firestone, too.
Yeah, so you get at Crestview, Beaver Local, and then at East Liverpool for those 3 games. I really like that schedule because I think that's going to test Salem in very different ways every time they play it. But I think Jackson Johnson, too, it's going to give him tests, too, against a lot of secondaries passing the game because he's going to be passing, he's going to be carrying. He's going to be such a dynamic quarterback, too, and he's going to be fun to watch. And if there was one matchup you just wish you could see, you want to see Jackson Johnson versus Vinny Balone. I think
Yeah.
would be a fun one too. But there's a lot of great quarterbacks in the area to watch for. And for someone going into his junior year, I think for Salem too, that those first 3 games, Crestview, Beaver Local, East Liverpool, they're going to be definitely fun games to watch. 2 of them being away at Crestview and at East Liverpool too. So an early test for the Quakers for sure.
Those other the other big game in the EBC is going to be Marlington. I mean, the Dukes are a very proud football program. They're going to be tough, and if Salem wants to get atop the league, they're going to have to go up against Marlington, and they're going to have to beat the Dukes.
Very realistic too, with how tough the Salem's schedule is for 6 games of the season, that they might be 3-3 going into face Marlington, maybe 4-2. So 3-3, you win against Marlington, now puts you at 4-3, 4-2 puts you at 5-2. So I mean, in a very tough D4, like you said, conference for playoff sake, record wise, that might be a huge game against Marlington October 1st.
Well, it's right in a big part of their season, as you said. It's a tough 6-game stretch. They're either going to be wanting to rebound after not going as well as they would want it to, or they're going to have to keep momentum going. Either way, that Marlington game is going to shape what they need in the final 2 games of the season coming after that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going into that final game of the season, before we get to that final game of the season, it's going to be huge for Salem. And while transition right before we talk about that final game,